Everyone, and thank you all for joining us for today's presentation. My name is Marissa, an attorney with Legal Aid of North Carolina's Helpline. Today we have attorney Amy presenting for us. If you are unfamiliar with the format of this event, first Amy is going to review a PowerPoint presentation. At the end of the presentation, we will have a question and answer session. If at any point during the presentation you have questions, you can put them in the Q&A box on Zoom or in the comments section on Facebook. We'll review all questions put in the chat boxes during that Q&A session at the end. Please remember that this is a public forum and legal aid is not representing you at this time. So be sure not to reveal personal details about yourself and to keep your questions as general as possible as we cannot provide any legal advice specific to your individual situation. The session will end when there are no more questions, and regardless of where we are, we will have a hard stop at 2 o'clock p.m. With all that being said, I'm going to pass it over to Amy to get us started.
Thank you, Marissa. Good afternoon, everyone. This is Amy Heimel. I am a staff attorney on the Medicaid appeals team here at Legal Aid of North Carolina. Today, we're going to talk about Medicaid billing in North Carolina. As of 2026, we have changed the types of cases that we are going to be handling at the Medicaid appeals team. We will no longer be handling Medicaid billing cases. Of course, we will still be helping with Medicaid eligibility and Medicaid denial and reduction of services. And for that reason, I thought it was important to talk to you today about Medicaid billing so that if you do have any billing issues, you'll have the knowledge that you need to be able to get a resolution. So let's get started. First of all, we need to talk about whether you're a Medicaid patient or a private patient. A Medicaid patient is a Medicaid beneficiary for whom the provider has generally agreed to bill Medicaid for any services or supplies that provider has rendered. A private patient, however, is a patient that the provider holds responsible for payment. A private patient could be someone who has private insurance. It could be someone who has Medicare or TRICARE, or it could even be a self-pay patient who has no insurance at all. To be treated as a Medicaid patient, a Medicaid beneficiary must first request to be accepted by the provider as a Medicaid patient, and then secondly, be accepted by the provider as a Medicaid patient. So you have to ask and then be accepted. Let's talk about acceptance as a Medicaid patient. A Medicaid beneficiary must request acceptance to be a Medicaid patient by either providing the Medicaid card or number to the provider, or telling the provider, if they don't have that card available, that they have Medicaid coverage so that the provider can confirm that in the Medicaid system, and telling the provider which managed care plan, if you're in a managed care plan for Medicaid, which one is your plan. You're accepted as a Medicaid patient when the provider puts your Medicaid information or card into their record system, or if the provider obtains any other proof of Medicaid coverage, such as checking the eligibility system in NC Tracks, or if the provider submits a claim to Medicaid for payment. Let's talk about when providers cannot bill you. Providers cannot bill a patient if the patient was accepted as a Medicaid beneficiary. So here, this very first line is from state law. It's from the state statute. A provider cannot bill a Medicaid beneficiary for services except for copays if the provider has accepted that beneficiary as a Medicaid patient. Now, providers do not have to accept the patient as a Medicaid patient, but if the patient is not accepted, providers can bill them as a private patient. Let's stop there for just a minute. So some providers try to balance their practices between different insurance companies and Medicaid. For that reason, they will limit the number of patients from that particular insurance. So if you're a Medicaid patient, for example, perhaps the provider is only going to accept, let's just say, 100 Medicaid patients into their practice. So when you call to make an appointment with a new provider and you ask them if they're taking Medicaid, they may tell you, yes, they take Medicaid, but you really need to be asking them if they are accepting new Medicaid patients, because there's a difference. They may accept Medicaid for the patients they already have, but they may have reached their limit and not want to accept an additional Medicaid patient because they're full. So there's a little bit of a nuance, a little difference that becomes really important in the billing world later on. So let's back up and read this line again. Providers do not have to accept a patient as a Medicaid patient, like I just explained. If the patient is not accepted, then that provider can bill them as a private patient or a self-pay patient. But, and this is the big but, providers must first inform the patient that they are not being accepted as a Medicaid patient and that they are billing this patient as a private patient before the services or supplies are provided. So they have to tell you up front before you go back to see the provider. They cannot accept you as a patient, not tell you that you're not being accepted as a Medicaid patient, have you see the provider, then when you go to check out, ask you for money or bill you for that service. They have to give you the option to decline the services and find another provider who will accept you as a Medicaid patient or under the managed care plan. So I hope that makes sense. If you don't understand that, just put something in the comments and we'll get to your question a little bit later. So again, you have to have the opportunity, if they're not going to bill Medicaid and they're not accepting you as a Medicaid patient, to be able to go somewhere else or to say, that's fine, I'm willing to pay for this service. Providers cannot bill fees. So providers cannot bill Medicaid patients for fees such as missed appointment fees. Now they can bill private pay, but they cannot bill you if you're a Medicaid patient. They also cannot bill for deposits, even if they tell you that it's refundable if Medicaid pays them. So they're just not allowed to do that. It's under state law. Now they can bill or collect at the time of service for any allowable copays. Usually there's a $4 copay for an office visit. Or if you're under the Medicaid deductible program, and you will be told that when you are accepted or approved for Medicaid, if you're under the deductible program, they will tell you that at that time. So it's not going to be a mystery. You'll know if you owe a deductible. Providers cannot bill for claims that are denied by Medicaid. So if you see your physician or your provider and they bill for Medicaid and the claim is denied, they cannot then turn around and say, oh, well, we're just going to go ahead and get the money from the patient. If a Medicaid claim is denied because the provider fails to follow the Medicaid regulations, and what I mean by that is they've made some sort of coding error when they submitted the claim, or they've done something, they haven't gotten prior authorization like they were supposed to, or they haven't sent the records in that were requested, something that's on the provider. If the claim is denied because the provider fails to follow the Medicaid regulations, or if the claim is denied because Medicaid determined that there was a lack of medical necessity, and again, that usually happens because the provider has not submitted the proper medical records, then a provider cannot bill a Medicaid patient for that service. So when can providers bill you? Providers can bill you for copays. There's a $4 copay per visit for chiropractic visits, doctor visits, non-emergency visits, emergency department visits, optometrist visits, outpatient hospital, which is when you're there for less than 24 hours, and also the podiatrist visits. There's also $4 copays per prescriptions for generic prescriptions and brand prescriptions. These copays changed from $3 to $4 per visit effective July 1st of 2022. So it's been going on for a while now. However, there are no copays for these beneficiaries: beneficiaries under 21, pregnant beneficiaries, beneficiaries receiving hospice care, federally recognized tribal members, uh, program beneficiaries who are participating in the North Carolina Breast and Cervical Cancer Program, children in foster care, and beneficiaries living in an institution. Now, here's a really important part at the very bottom of this screen. Providers cannot deny a beneficiary service because they cannot pay their copay at the time of service. Now, if you owe a copay, they can bill you for the copay after the service, and you are responsible for it, but they cannot turn you away at the door because you do not have your $4 copay. There are no copays for these services: behavioral health services, traumatic brain injury services, intellectual or developmental IDD services. Providers can bill deductibles. So as I mentioned, some Medicaid beneficiaries do have a deductible. For an example, they have a deductible that they're responsible for, so that once they meet that, they qualify for Medicaid or for CAP services. Just as a reminder, a deductible is the amount of a medical expense a beneficiary must have before Medicaid coverage begins. Beneficiaries are responsible for medical expenses up to that amount of their deductible. Medicaid then covers any expenses beyond the deductible amount. And providers can bill the beneficiary until they reach their medical deductible. Now let's dive into this a little bit. So if you have been approved for Medicaid under the deductible program, then you will be responsible, as I just said, for any bills up to that amount. When you have those bills, you turn them into DSS to your caseworker, and they keep those on file. And then once you reach your deductible limit, then they will activate your Medicaid. And then once that is activated, then anything after you've met the deductible will be paid by Medicaid once the provider bills the claim to Medicaid. So here's an example. You have a Medicaid deductible of $1,000. Providers can bill you for services up until $1,000, and Medicaid will pay for medical expenses you have beyond that deductible. However, you're still responsible for those medical expenses that were part of that $1,000. Now, note, the medical bills can be counted towards meeting the deductible, even if they're not paid. So what I'm saying is, you owe the hospital perhaps $1,000, but you don't have to have paid that $1,000 in order for you to become eligible for Medicaid. Again, if this sounds confusing, feel free to ask questions in the chat. I don't want you to worry about whether you have a deductible or not. If you have a deductible, you will know it because your caseworker, when you applied for Medicaid, would have told you that you are eligible under a deductible program, and this is the amount of your deductible. Okay? Inability to pay at time of service. A Medicaid patient cannot be denied services or supplies based on their inability to pay for allowable copays, deductibles, and coinsurance. However, the patient is still financially responsible for those copays, deductible, and coinsurance, and the provider can bill the patient for that. So this is a little bit of a summary of what we just talked about. A person with a pending Medicaid application can request to be accepted as a Medicaid patient even before the application is approved. So what I mean by that is, when you have put in an application for Medicaid and it is just you're just waiting to have everything processed. You've given them all of your income and resource information. The application is on file. You can still call a provider and let them know, hey, I have applied for Medicaid. Are you accepting Medicaid patients? And if they say yes, and they have accepted you and it's just pending, then you can go ahead and be seen as a Medicaid patient. However, if that application is denied, then obviously the provider cannot bill Medicaid for it. So then in this situation, even though you were accepted as a Medicaid patient, If you really don't have Medicaid after the application is processed, then the provider then can turn around and bill you for any services or supplies already provided. Providers can bill for exceeding visit limits. So Medicaid has an annual visit limit for many services. Providers will not get paid by Medicaid for visits over the annual limit without a prior approval from Medicaid. Providers can bill Medicaid patients for visits that exceed the annual visit limit, but only if the provider tells the patient before the visit, so that you have the option to say no. Um, so that's pretty straightforward. If you don't know what your visit limits are, you should call the Medicaid contact center, and they can pull your eligibility and tell you how many visits you have left for the year. Providers can bill for non-covered services or supplies. So after accepting a Medicaid patient, providers can bill a patient as a private patient for anything that's not usually covered by Medicaid. If it's outside the Medicaid coverage policy, then they can bill you for it. However, again, information is key. The provider must tell the Medicaid patient before the treatment that it's not covered by Medicaid, or it may not be covered by Medicaid, and that they're going to bill for these services and supplies. Again, it gives you the option to decline the service or supply, or to say, that's fine, this is important to me, it doesn't matter if Medicaid's not covering it, I'll pay for it. Providers can bill third-party insurance. If you have Medicare or private insurance or TRICARE, in addition to Medicaid, then you should tell your provider. If there's a third party that is liable for your medical expenses, such as workers' comp insurance, you should also tell your provider. There's something in Medicaid that's called payer of last resort. Okay. What that means is Medicaid is always at the bottom of the insurance payers. So Medicaid will not pay claims until all of your other insurances first pay their part of the claim. For example, if you have Medicare and Medicaid, then the provider needs to bill Medicare first. Then once Medicare pays, then Medicaid will pay their part. Same thing if you had Medicare and TRICARE and Medicaid. If you had, let's just say, private insurance and Medicaid, private insurance would pay before Medicaid. So it's really important, and this has been a bit of a problem that we've seen, is that the providers don't always have the full information, especially if somebody has been awarded Medicare retroactively, or they've turned 65 and they're now eligible for Medicare, and perhaps they haven't been to the provider in a while. They may forget to tell that provider, hey, I have Medicare now. And so it's really important they know, because if they just send it to Medicaid and there's another insurance involved, Medicaid is going to deny it. And there is a time limit on claims as far as how long the provider has to submit claims and be paid. So, sometimes these things take a while. We don't want to run out of time, because if the provider did not have the proper information, they run out of time, they can turn around and bill you for it. So it's really important to make sure that they have all of your insurance information. And I don't have a slide on this, but the same goes for if you go to the hospital and you have Medicaid, or let's say the emergency room, for example, or you've been taken away in an ambulance. These two things I've seen a lot. And you start getting a bill from perhaps some doctor, some emergency services, or an ambulance service. When you go to the hospital and you give the hospital your Medicaid card or your other insurance information, it goes into their system. But the doctors that work in that ER are separate and apart from the hospital. They have their own little emergency practice. So you may receive a bill from them. They are not connected. Their billing software is not connected. So they will not have your Medicaid information. The ambulance service will not have your Medicaid information. So as soon as you get bills from either one of those, be sure to call them and give them your Medicaid ID number so that they can go ahead and timely bill Medicaid, and then you will not get these enormous bills in the mail. So we have seen that a lot. Okay. Providers can bill dual enrollees. Dual enrollees are Medicaid beneficiaries who are also enrolled in Medicare. A provider can bill a Medicaid patient when the patient is enrolled in Medicare, when the service or supplies are received, and the patient, so let's see, let me back up for a minute. A patient can bill a Medicaid patient when the patient is enrolled in Medicare, when the service or supplies are received, and when the patient does not provide the Medicare number or proof of Medicare coverage, which is what I'm saying. If a provider does not have that Medicare information, they do not know to bill Medicare. And so they're going to bill Medicaid. Medicaid is going to come back and say that there's a coordination of benefits problem. And then the provider is going to turn around and just bill the Medicaid patient because they do not know who to bill first. So again, sounding like a broken record, but it's really important because we've seen a lot of problems with this. Make sure you provide your Medicare information whenever you provide your Medicaid information to providers. Again, Medicaid is the last payer of all the insurances. Providers can bill when not eligible for Medicaid. So a provider can bill a patient who's been accepted as a Medicaid patient for services and supplies provided if that patient was not actually eligible for Medicaid for that date of service, and those services or supplies were provided. A provider who bills a private patient, so I'm self-pay or I have other insurance, who's later found to be retroactively eligible for Medicaid, so you've been approved and it goes back in time, and the services were provided, can bill Medicaid. The patient, so let's say you have no insurance and you're self-pay. And then later you see the doctor because you have no choice, even though you have no insurance. And then later you are approved for Medicaid, but the effective date of your Medicaid goes backward in time to before that date of service or is on that date of service, and you saw the doctor, then the provider, and let's say that when you saw the doctor and you were self-pay, they required you to pay some money or a deposit, because at that point you weren't technically a Medicaid patient. So you paid some money to them and then you became eligible. You call the doctor's office, hey, I was approved and it goes back to, it covers that visit that I had. Then they can bill Medicaid, but note, they don't have to bill Medicaid because you were not technically a Medicaid patient at the time. So it's their choice. You can ask them to do it, but they don't have to do it under state law. They can bill Medicaid. And then if they are paid by Medicaid, then the money that you paid them, they have to reimburse you. In other words, they cannot take money from you for that date of service and then turn around and bill Medicaid and get paid again for that date of service and keep those two payments. They have to reimburse you. Okay, but then this is where it gets tricky. If they have the money in hand from you, they don't have to bill Medicaid. And many of them don't, just because they figure, well, we've got the money, so why go through the effort? But there are some really great providers out there who feel the opposite and say, hey, absolutely, if this can be paid by Medicaid, we'll be happy to submit a claim and refund you the money once we receive payment from Medicaid. Okay, let's talk about another issue we've seen: providers billing for out-of-state services. They break that down into two categories: providers that are providers that are within 40 miles of the North Carolina border, and then providers who are beyond 40 miles of the North Carolina border. So the border providers who are within 40 miles of the North Carolina border are within Georgia, South Carolina, Tennessee, and Virginia. The rule is that services will be covered by Medicaid as long as they are medically necessary. And those providers will be treated and paid as if they are in North Carolina and they're North Carolina providers. Now, this is where it gets a little bit tricky. The provider must be enrolled with North Carolina Medicaid, and you must tell them that you have North Carolina Medicaid and or managed care Medicaid. So you need to let the providers know that so they can decide whether or not they're going to accept you and provide services and bill Medicaid. So the other group is the out-of-state providers. They're beyond 40 miles from the border. Let me go back just for a second. For the providers that are within 40 miles of the border, we have really not had issues with them. Most providers that are within 40 miles of North Carolina, they are signed up with Medicaid unless they're a really, really small provider, like a single doctor in the practice where it's just too expensive for him or her, or they don't see that many patients from North Carolina, something like that. But the major providers we have found that we have worked with that are within 40 miles are signed up with Medicaid. Okay, moving back. Out-of-state providers beyond 40 miles from the border are covered only when services are not available in North Carolina. And if that is the case, then the provider needs to get prior approval before the visit in order to be paid for that visit. Prior approval will not be given to that provider if Medicaid is not the primary insurance. And also, it's really important to note that referrals from your doctor to another doctor beyond 40 miles from the border, those are not prior approval. Well, your provider may want you to go see someone at the Cleveland Clinic. That is not a prior approval by Medicaid. The Cleveland Clinic would need to contact Medicaid and get prior approval for that visit before they would bill that to Medicaid and get paid. Regarding emergency medical care, you can receive emergency medical care beyond 40 miles from the border when the life or health of the patient would be endangered if care were postponed until you could return to North Carolina. Then once you are discharged, any follow-up care would need to be in North Carolina, or the out-of-state provider who is giving follow-up care would need to get prior approval for that follow-up care. Again, in bold, I wrote, provider must be enrolled with North Carolina Medicaid to be paid. They have to be in the Medicaid system, or there's no way for them to submit the claim. There's no way for Medicaid to pay them. Now, I do want to say, let's go back to emergency medical care. If you are not sure if this is going to be paid and you are in an emergency and you need emergency medical care, please go get emergency medical care because you can always work it out after the fact. If for some reason Medicaid was not going to pay the claim, then you could work out a repayment plan with the hospital. You could ask for charity care. If you need emergency care and you are out of state, please go get emergency care. And please do not say, I don't think Medicaid's going to pay for this, so I'm just not going to get the emergency care that I require. Okay. What to do when you have a bill? All right, when you receive that bill, first thing you need to do is to call your provider's billing department as soon as you get a bill, okay? Don't delay, don't put it off. Again, there are time limits to how long Medicaid will accept a claim from the provider and then pay them. So you want to make sure that your provider's billing department has your insurance information. Mistakes are made. Sometimes they will have issues with their systems where maybe it will pull one of your old insurance that you had a long time ago and they'll be billing the wrong insurance. It could be they have your Medicaid number wrong. It could be that something has slipped through the system and they don't have you listed as having any insurance. It could be that situation that I mentioned where the hospital physicians don't have your information even though the hospital did. The ambulance service doesn't have the information even though the hospital does. So don't delay. Confirm that they have your correct insurance information, and then ask them, why are you being billed? If they did not have your insurance information, then ask them to resubmit the claim. And just make sure, did you have a different primary insurance and then Medicaid is secondary? If you had primary insurance, you need to make sure they have that on file as well as your Medicaid. If they did have the information, everything's checking out, then ask them for a detailed billing statement. And then once that arrives, check your statement. Is it correct? Is the date of service correct? Is the type of service correct? I mean, they do make mistakes. So if not, tell them that you dispute the charges. And if for some reason you receive a bill and you did not have active insurance, then please ask them about financial assistance or charity care or some type of discount. And then if you still need help, then you can always call the North Carolina Medicaid Ombudsman and let them know that you are having a billing issue with a provider. And their number is 877-201-3750, and they're open 8 to 5 Monday through Friday. Here is a helpful blog post. And this is going to be available. I don't know if you can pause your screen if you're watching this after the live session, but this is a really helpful blog post from North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services about Medicaid billing. And then you can also share it with your provider to help them with any billing issues or questions. So that's all I have for today. This free clinic series about your rights is the fourth Friday of every month from 12 to 1. The next one will be February 27th. We'll have another one March 27th. We try to do a different topic every single month, depending on what's going on. But as I mentioned, as of January, right now, we are no longer taking billing cases on the Medicaid appeals team. We're really focusing on denials of eligibility, reductions of eligibility, denials of service, reductions of service, cases like that. So I really wanted to give you some information you can use if you indeed have some billing issues. So that's it. I hope that was helpful, and feel free to ask me any questions that you may have.
Awesome. And so if you have a question for Amy, you either need to type it in the Q&A box on Zoom or put it in the comment section on Facebook. You cannot unmute in this forum. So if you have a question, you need to put it in one of those two places. I'm not seeing any questions at the moment, so gonna give just a few moments here to see if any questions do come in.
That sounds great. Thank you so much. Oh, and since we don't have any questions, I'm afraid to go off this screen and try to show you. So I'm just going to mention it. We have some really exciting things that are happening at Legal Aid that I think you will find valuable. We have a new Justice Hub where you can actually go on our website at www.legalaid, that's LEGALAID, no E on that last one, .org. And you can go to our website and you can actually sign up for intake. There's a little screen that you can go, that there's a button in the top right corner to get started. And so instead of trying to, if you have a case or you have an issue that you think you need legal services for, you can go to the website, you can sign up through the portal, and then that way you don't have to try to get through our phone line. We know we've been really busy. A lot of people have been trying to get through. They've been frustrated. We have created this new portal to make it easier for you to be able to seek help with legal issues. So you sign up and you put your information in there, and then it ends up going to our intake team, and then somebody will get back to you. You can do it anytime, 24/7. It's open on the weekends, it's open at night, so you're not sitting and being frustrated trying to get through on the telephone. So that's exciting. The second thing that's exciting on that website is we have a new little virtual helper named Leah. And she's kind of in the bottom right hand part. She'll pop up. She's a little pop up. And you can actually type in a question that you may have, some type of legal question if you're having an issue. Kind of has to be short. It's a general question, such as, for example, how do I appeal my Medicaid denial of eligibility or something like that. And then virtually she'll pop up and she'll give you more information about the subject matter that you're asking about. So both of those things are really exciting. We're trying to serve more people and we're trying to make it easier for you and give you as much valuable information as we can. So if you want to go to our website, www.legalaidnc.org, and check those two things out, and hopefully those will be really helpful to you.
Yes, I did see a hand raise again. You can't unmute, so if you have a question, please type that in the Q&A box in the next few quick moments here, as well as I put a link to the Justice Hub that Amy was just talking about. I have put that into the chat if somebody wants to be able to click on that link.
Thanks, Marissa.
So gotta give it just a second to see if that hand raise did have a question. Again, I keep seeing the hand raise. You cannot unmute in this form. If you have a question, you need to type it into the Q&A box.
They might have raised their hand and not realized it.
Yeah. Okay. Giving it just a few seconds more. All right.
Okay,
Well,
wonderful.
to be cut,
Yeah, thank you,
cognizant of
everybody. Hope to see you next month.
everyone have a good one.
Thanks, Marissa. Bye-bye.
Thanks.